Set 6 decks. It's actually hard to say. I feel like I'm nearly accidentally saying sexy decks. Hello everybody and welcome to another video with me, Hazmat Lorcana. We're coming up to 2 weeks now since the release of Azurite Sea, and by looking at the winning decks from the 4 tournaments that I've got lined up, we can get a good idea of the decks that we'll likely be seeing going forward. The only thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the top players will be holding their best list back for the Continental Challenge events coming up soon, and as such we can take what we see here with maybe a little bit of a pinch of salt. And of course, as always, this is the part of the video where I ask you to subscribe and like, so yeah, please do that. But enough with that, let's take a look at some Set 6 decks. The Southside Gaming Tournament was a quadruple case tournament out in the US. It had 71 players, and the winner was actually a Amethyst Steel deck, piloted by Dylan Crowley. And what Dylan's brewed up here looks to be a mid-range purple steel deck with a lot of shift options, such as Tinkerbell, the Queen of the Azurite Fairies, which is a new card for Set 6. Tinkerbell is a giant 5/6 evasive. She shifts for 5, quests for 2, and whenever she does quests, she gives other fairy characters an extra lore for this turn. This works well for a number of reasons. One, a 5/6 evasive that quests for 2 is just quite terrifying on its own, but 2, the extra lore that she gives to fairies not only works with the Tinkerbell giant fairy, but also their shift target, which is the Tinkerbell fast flyer that also came out in this set. Not to mention the blue fairy, which they've also opted to include in this deck for the card draw. You think about how many Floodborn shifts there are in this deck, well, this is perfect because with every one that they play, they'll be able to draw a card as well. And not only that, but don't forget that Tinkerbell Queen of the Azurite Fairies effect will give the blue fairy an extra lore as well. And whilst the blue fairy is only a 1/1, she is evasive, so questing for 2 while evasive is always a good thing. Speaking of things that quest for 2 and are also evasive, Dylan's opted for 3 Genie Wish Fulfilled in here as well. And we mentioned this card in the run-up to the set's release. It looks insanely strong. Evasive 2/4 stat line that also quests for 2 is going to be really hard to remove and a massive pain in the butt. On top of that, he replaces himself when he's played, and that is to say that he draws a card. So yeah, an exceptionally good card, and I'm not surprised to see it make it in this deck. An old but golden combination is also Grab Your Sword and Giant Tink. Dealing 3 damage to everything across the board is brutal, especially in a meta that's looking quite aggressive, as you'll see from the decks that we're going to look at. A lot of characters have 3 health, and the Giant Tink doing 1 damage to everything when she's played, plus Grab Your Swords, it just deals 3 damage across the board and is likely to wipe their entire board. Speaking of the aggressive decks, Dylan's also included 4 copies of Robin Hood Champion of Sherwood, along with its shift target Robin Hood Beloved Outlaw, because Robin Hood Champion of Sherwood is a fantastic option to deal with these aggressive decks. And think of the new cards they've got, cards like Calhoun. Well, Robin Hood comes down on the turn after that and can take her out, as well as gain 2 lore in the process. That'll teach her for stealing his ability. Now let's move on to the Battlebed tournament out in Germany. This tournament had 47 players and featured a well-known winner, and that of course was Artabax on green-purple nonetheless. Artabax has gone for a 60 character card deck, meaning absolutely no actions or items or locations. But my goodness does it look like it's capable of being very aggressive indeed. And not only that, but the characters themselves provide the card draw. For example, we have the Clarabelle shift line, along with 3 copies of Merlin Rabbit and 4 copies of Genie Wish Fulfilled. So I think there's enough card draw within these cards alone to actually justify not having to run any actions. The shell of this deck is very familiar to what we're used to seeing, but with some additions that help see out the game, such as the White Rose, Jewel of the Garden, to gain that lore upon being played, along with Go-Go Tomogo, who has the potential to gain lots of lore when she's played. The number of Kick Cloud Kickers included in the deck has been up to 4. This card's going to be fantastic at stopping some of the early aggression in these aggressive decks that we're seeing at the start of the set, and so that's a fantastic meta read from Artabax. The only thing I will say is this deck looks like it'd have a rough time coming up against anything steel, so I guess just dodge those matchups. In my playtesting with green, cards like Curse Merfolk and also Banzai just don't deal well into steel decks at all. They just take one Let the Storm Rage on to get rid of them. And Merfolk's effect doesn't even trigger off that as just a little extra kick in the teeth. Now let's take a look at the Battle of the Bay tournament that happened out in the US. There was 138 players and the winner of the event was Ed on a Ruby Amethyst deck. And what's interesting to note is that of the top 4 players in this event, 2 of them were on Ruby Amethyst and 2 were on Amethyst Steel. But in my experience of playing in recent events, there's not been a lot of Ruby Amethyst players actually out there. Perhaps they're just doing what Ruby Amethyst players do and making sure that they've got it right for the back end of the set. But that being said, Ed here managed to pull an impressive win over the 138 players at this tournament. And taking a look at the deck, we've got some interesting choices actually here. The notable set 6 additions are of course Genie, Wish Fulfilled, as we've come to expect at this point in Amethyst. And wouldn't you have guessed it from the Ruby side, but it is Maui Half Shark. Just the 2 copies of Maui Half Shark. This seems to be somewhat of the standard across decks that I've seen. The only problem with Maui is that a lot of the steel decks that are really popular at the moment include copies of Along Came Zeus, and Maui Shark is just such a perfect target for that. The couple of interesting things that I wanted to look at this deck were that they have 2 copies of Sisu, Empowered Sibling. At the back end of last set, the Ruby Amethyst decks tended to drop down to only 1 copy of Sisu, but with the amount of low to the ground aggressive decks we're seeing in this set, I can see why Ed's upped that to 2 copies instead. Looking a bit further down at the actions, and we're seeing 4 copies of Brawl and 2 Dragonfire. 4 copies of Brawl is essential, and it has been for the last couple of sets. But even more so in this one, where again, we're seeing all these aggressive decks. You need to stop those early threats as quickly as possible. Which is also likely why we're seeing copies of Dragonfire. Yes, I know that 5 cost uninkable for just banishing 1 character seems a bit ridiculous, but there are simply too many decks that are just going really wide, and also decks that have these big threats. The amount of removal needed in decks to keep up with this has gone up. And so I can see why 2 copies of Dragonfire have been added. And on top of that, it works well with Maui Shark being able to get it back from the discard pile and then just play it again. What I did notice was missing from this deck was any copies of Merlin Crab, and I really think that that card is quite essential in decks at the moment. Not only can you combo him with Madam Mim Fox to take out big threats, but he's also useful to use in combination with cards such as Elsa, the 5th Spirit, and that'll allow you to take out things such as Genie, Wish Fulfilled, or a Diablo that's in the Hidden Cove. So if you are planning on playing Ruby Amethyst, I would still consider making a place for Merlin Crab. Last weekend, out in France, there was a 140 player tournament hosted by For the Law, and the winner of this tournament was Moosh on Emerald Amethyst, and this is actually a carbon copy of Artabax's deck. Furthermore, showing that this deck is actually quite fantastic. And I've played against it now, and I can tell you that it is indeed pretty damn strong. Expect to see this exact list quite a few times in the coming weeks. In a recent tournament that I played in the top 8, there were about 3 Emerald Amethyst players. So yeah, these were the winning decks across some of the big tournaments that we've seen since the release of Set 6. What I can comfortably tell you is that Emerald Amethyst and Amethyst Steel are in an exceptionally good place. Following that, it's hard to say. There's 3 decks that are probably in the tier down from that, and that is Red Blue, Green Steel, and of course Steel Song. So when it comes to building your own decks, just keep in mind that these are the decks that you're most likely going to be coming up against, and try and build in a way that it works well against those. And there was a big UK tournament that I didn't mention in this video, and that of course was the Axion event out in Birmingham. And whilst I myself managed to come 15th, a close friend of mine actually managed to win the whole thing, and that was Stefan Hadley. So what we're going to do in a following video is actually sit down with Stefan and take a look at the deck and actually ask him about his choices and to talk through why he picked what. So keep an eye out for that one, should be very insightful and a good watch. But until then, I've been Hazmat Lorcana, you've been you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! This weekend just passed out in France, but for some reason I am adding words in. This week, are you sure? Last weekend out in France, there was a tournament with Last weekend out in France, there was a tournament with over I can't talk.